They thought they were arresting just another black woman in a town where no one ever questioned a badge, but the sky was already on its way to prove them wrong. The first thing people would remember later was not the handcuffs, not the patrol lights washing the street in red and blue, not even the way Officer Trent Walker stood there with his jaw locked like he owned every inch of that dusty road. It was the sound, low at first, almost mistaken for distant thunder rolling across the flat Georgia fields, then sharper, heavier, deliberate enough to make a child at the edge of the crowd stop chewing the straw in his mouth and look up. But before anyone lifted their eyes to the sky, all attention had been fixed on the woman beside the squad car. Ava Brooks did not look the way Trent expected trouble to look. She wore a dark navy blouse tucked into pressed slacks, practical flats dusted from the roadside, and a watch with a plain black band that seemed too understated for someone standing this calm in the middle of public humiliation. Her hands were restrained in front of her, but her posture never bent. Her breathing stayed even. Her face, framed by the heat of the afternoon sun, carried no panic and no plea, only the kind of stillness that made men like Trent angrier because it refused to hand them the reaction they wanted. Around them, the town had gathered the way small towns always did when power decided to make a spectacle of itself. A mechanic in oil-stained coveralls stood beside the gas pump across the street. An older woman in a church hat clutched her purse with both hands, her mouth pressed into a line too tired to be surprised. Two teenage boys leaned against a pickup truck, phones half-raised, uncertain whether what they were filming would become proof or just another memory no one wanted to keep. Trent adjusted his belt and looked Ava over with the slow contempt of a man who had spent years mistaking authority for character. He had already asked for her license 3 times. He had already ignored the answer she gave. He had already decided that her silence was attitude and her confidence was disrespect. "You should have cooperated from the start," he said, loud enough for the onlookers to hear, the words hanging in the heat like a warning meant for more than one person. Ava lifted her eyes to his and answered in a voice so steady it almost disappeared under the hum of the cruiser engine. "I told you exactly who I am." Trent gave a dry laugh, the kind that invited the people around him to laugh too, though none of them did. "And I told you," he said, stepping back as if the scene were already finished, "that around here, that doesn't mean a thing." The older woman across the street flinched at that. One of the boys lowered his phone. Somewhere behind the crowd, a screen door creaked open and then shut again. Ava turned her head slightly, not toward Trent, not toward the cruiser, but toward the western edge of town where the fields opened into tree line and power lines cut across the horizon. It was such a small movement that most people missed it, but the mechanic noticed. So did the child with the straw in his mouth. And then the air changed. First came a tremor through the silence, then a rhythm, deep and mechanical, beating against the afternoon like a second heartbeat. Trent frowned and glanced upward, irritated before he was afraid. Dust began to stir along the shoulder of the road. The red and blue reflections flickered across Ava's face, but she did not look at the lights anymore. She looked at the sky, and for the first time since Trent had stopped her, the people of that town understood something he did not. Whatever was coming was not coming for her. 22 minutes earlier, the town of Briar's Edge had looked like the kind of place people forgot on purpose. One gas station, one diner with a sun-faded sign, one courthouse with chipped white columns, and a sheriff's office squatting across from Main Street like it had been built to remind everyone who mattered there. The July heat lay over everything like a thick blanket, pressing the scent of asphalt, dust, and cut grass into the air until even breathing felt slow. Pickup trucks rolled past at 20 miles an hour. Old men sat outside the barber shop with nothing new to say, and the people who had lived there long enough had learned to keep their eyes forward whenever a patrol car crept by. Ava Brooks entered town without drama, driving a gray rental sedan that already carried a film of red dust along its lower doors. She moved through Briar's Edge with the careful attention of someone who never wasted a glance. She noticed the church sign promising revival on Sunday, the rusted water tower standing over the tree line, the teenager on a bicycle who froze when he saw a sheriff's cruiser, and the way conversations on the diner porch softened the second her car passed. She had been in towns like this before. Towns where silence worked harder than law. Towns where people did not need to say what they believed because the streets said it for them. Her phone sat face down in the passenger seat beside a manila folder and a sealed envelope marked with no return address. She did not touch either one. At exactly 2:13 in the afternoon, she pulled into the parking lot of Miller's Fuel and Market, a cracked patch of pavement bordered by an ice freezer, a flickering soda machine, and two pumps old enough to remember cheaper gasoline. She shut off the engine, stepped out, and let the heat settle around her. A bell chimed when she entered the store. Cold air spilled over her skin, carrying the smell of burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. Behind the register, a thin cashier with silver reading glasses glanced up, offered a tired nod, and then looked past Ava toward the front windows as if checking whether someone had seen her be polite. Ava walked to the cooler, took a bottle of water, and paused near the rack of local maps by the door. On the glass outside, reflected faintly over the parking lot, she saw the slow approach of a sheriff's cruiser easing off Main Street. Not fast, not urgent, curious, predatory. She did not turn right away. Instead, she set the water on the counter, paid in cash, and asked the cashier where County Road 12 crossed the old timber line. The woman hesitated for half a second before answering in a near whisper, "You are not from around here, are you?" It was not really a question. Ava gave a small, unreadable smile. "Just passing through," she said. The cashier looked like she wanted to warn her about something, but fear got there first. Outside, the cruiser had stopped at an angle that made leaving inconvenient on purpose. Officer Trent Walker stepped out, sunglasses on, hand resting near his belt, wearing the confident posture of a man who had never been told no in public. He took one look at Ava, then at the out-of-county plates, and the faint curve of his mouth said he had already decided this stop would be about more than directions. Ava twisted the cap off her water bottle and took one small sip before setting it on the hood of her car. The cicadas screamed from the pines. Somewhere behind the store, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Walker approached with the lazy swagger of someone preparing a performance, and when his shadow crossed her shoes, Ava understood that whatever this town had been hiding was about to reveal itself much sooner than planned. Trent Walker stopped a few feet from Ava and removed his sunglasses just long enough to let the moment settle the way men like him enjoyed, slow and deliberate, as if attention itself were part of the uniform. Up close, he looked exactly like the town around him felt, sunbaked, rigid, and too certain of his place in the world. His tan shirt was pressed flat despite the heat, his badge polished to a shine that caught the afternoon light, and his expression carried that familiar mix of suspicion and entitlement Ava had seen in a dozen counties across 3 different states. He glanced at the bottle of water on her hood, the rental car, the folder visible through the windshield, and then back at her face as though every ordinary detail only deepened his doubt. "License and registration," he said. Not rude on the surface. Not yet. But his tone made it clear this was not a request, and never had been. Ava reached into her bag with calm, measured movements, and handed him both documents without a word. He studied the out-of-state license a second longer than necessary. "Virginia," he said, like the word itself was suspicious. "What brings you to Briar's Edge, Miss Brooks?" The cashier inside the store had gone still behind the register. Through the glass, Ava could feel the woman watching without. Appearing to watch. Across the street, the mechanic at the pump bent over an engine block, but kept one ear turned toward the lot. The whole town seemed to know how these scenes unfolded. Ava folded one hand over the other and answered evenly. "I am on my way to a scheduled meeting." Walker let out a short laugh. "A scheduled meeting," he repeated. "That is interesting, because people who come here for scheduled meetings usually know where they are going." He tipped his chin toward the local map rack inside the store. "You looked lost to me." Ava did not blink. Looking for a crossroad is not the same as being lost. Something in that answer hardened him. It was not what she said. It was the fact that she said it without shrinking. Walker slid the license back into one hand and took a half step closer. "You got family here?" "No friends. No business. Private." That word landed like a challenge. A muscle moved in his jaw. Small towns often survived on one unwritten rule: strangers explained themselves. And strangers who looked like Ava explained themselves twice. He circled her car slowly, eyes moving over the trunk, the back seat, the rental sticker near the rear window. "Private," he said again, louder this time, giving the word to the empty air like a joke everyone was meant to understand. "You hear that?" He called toward the storefront without taking his eyes off Ava. Private. The cashier looked down immediately. No one answered. Walker stopped at the passenger's side and peered through the window at the envelope on the seat. What is in the folder? Documents. What kind of documents? The kind you do not need. That did it. The smile that touched his face had no warmth in it. You know, Ms. Brooks, where I come from, people who talk like that usually have something to hide. Ava lifted her eyes toward him fully now, and for the first time he saw not nerves, not fear, but an almost clinical patience, as if she were measuring him against something he could not see. And where I come from, she said softly. People who assume too much usually regret it. For one suspended second, even the cicadas seemed to pull back. The words were not loud. They were not dramatic, but they changed the temperature of the moment. Walker stared at her, and in his face she saw the decision happen. This was no longer a traffic stop in his mind. It was a lesson, a public correction, something to remind the parking lot, the store, and the watching windows that authority in Briar's Edge did not like being spoken to that way. He turned toward his cruiser and spoke into the radio clipped at his shoulder. His voice was casual, but Ava heard the coded shift underneath it, the quiet invitation for company, for witnesses, for backup. Then he looked back at her and said, "Do not go anywhere." Ava glanced once toward the edge of town where the road disappeared into heat shimmer and pine shadow. "That depends," she said, "on whether your town is ready for what it just started." The second cruiser rolled in less than a minute later, tires crunching over gravel with the casual confidence of men who never expected to be questioned. Deputy Cole Mercer stepped out first, younger than Trent but built from the same material, the same hard eyes, the same easy contempt, the same habit of scanning Ava as if her existence required explanation. He adjusted the brim of his cap, looked from Trent to Ava, then let out a low whistle when he saw the Virginia license still in Trent's hand. "Out of town," he said. "That usually means one of two things." Trent smirked. "She says she is here for private business." Cole's smile widened, not because the answer meant anything, but because it gave them room to keep the game going. The two of them stood near Ava's car as though they were not talking about her, but around her, using the old trick of making someone feel invisible while forcing them to remain at the center of the humiliation. Trent asked again where she was headed. Ava gave the same answer. Cole asked who she was meeting. Ava said that information was not theirs to demand. Trent asked if there was anything illegal in the car. Ava told him he had no lawful reason to search it. Each response was calm, measured, controlled, and with every second that control seemed to irritate them more. People had begun to notice. The mechanic across the street wiped his hands with a rag and stopped pretending not to watch. A mother loading grocery bags into the back of her sport utility vehicle hesitated with one hand on the hatch. The old woman in the church hat had not moved at all. Small towns learned to read danger by tone before action, and the tone in that parking lot was shifting from suspicion to performance. Trent leaned one forearm against the roof of Ava's rental and lowered his voice, though not enough to keep the crowd from hearing. "You know what your problem is, Miss Brooks," he said. "You walked in here acting like rules do not apply to you." Ava turned to face him fully, her expression composed, the heat pressing a fine sheen across her brow, but never touching the steadiness in her voice. "No," she said. "My problem is that you keep inventing rules because you do not like my answers." Cole let out a short laugh and looked around as if inviting the town to appreciate the line, but no one joined him. Even the silence seemed to reject what they were doing. Trent straightened, embarrassed now, and the embarrassment made him sharper. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with roads or directions, where Ava worked, why she was dressed the way she was, why someone like her would be carrying sealed documents into Briar's Edge on a Thursday afternoon. There it was, laid bare in plain daylight, the kind of language that always managed to hide behind official tone while meaning exactly what it meant. Ava heard the cashier inside the store drop something near the counter. Cole walked to the passenger side and tapped the glass near the envelope with one knuckle. "Could save us all some time and just tell us what is in there," he said. "No," Ava replied. "I could save all of you a great deal more time if you stepped away from this car." That answer landed heavier than the others. Trent's face cooled into something more dangerous because it was quieter. He took out a small notepad, wrote down her plate number, then went back to the radio on his shoulder and asked dispatch to run everything again. There was a pause. Static answered first, then a clipped voice, then more static. Trent frowned and pressed the button harder, repeating the request. The sound came back distorted, as though the signal itself had begun slipping through his fingers. Cole glanced up toward the power lines stretching beyond the gas station. Radio has been acting strange all afternoon, he muttered. Ava heard it, and for the first time a nearly invisible change touched her face. Not fear, not satisfaction, just recognition. Trent caught it. You smiling at something? He asked. Ava shook her head once. No, she said. I am listening. To what? Cole snapped. Ava lifted her eyes past them, not dramatically, not like someone trying to win a moment, but like someone noticing a clock had begun ticking louder. The wind moved through the pines beyond the road. A paper cup rolled across the lot. Somewhere far off, deep enough to be mistaken for memory, there came the first faint pulse of a sound neither deputy could place yet. Ava spoke before either man could. This is the last quiet minute you are going to get, she said. Trent Walker had spent most of his adult life confusing calm with defiance, and by the time Ava finished speaking, he had already decided that whatever she meant to imply, he would crush it in front of witnesses. That was the way men like him kept order in places like Briar's Edge. Not through wisdom, not through fairness, but through spectacle. He stepped away from the cruiser and squared his shoulders as if preparing for something official, though everyone in the lot could see this was no longer about procedure. Cole Mercer moved closer to Ava's passenger door, peering through the glass again at the manila folder and the sealed envelope, then back at her with a grin that looked rehearsed from years of getting away with the same expression. You hear that? Cole said, glancing at Trent. She is still making threats. No, Ava replied, her voice level enough to make the word sharper. I am giving you a warning you are not wise enough to recognize. The mechanic across the street froze with the rag still in his hand. The mother by the sport utility vehicle quietly pulled her young son behind her leg. Even the cashier inside Miller's Fuel and Market seemed to stop breathing. Briar's Edge had seen tense moments before. People whispered about them after church, over coffee, on porches after dark. But this felt different. There was something in the air now, something larger than a local deputy and a parking lot argument. Trent turned back toward Ava and held up the Virginia license between two fingers. You came into my town with a sealed package, a made-up attitude, and no intention of answering simple questions, he said. That gives me plenty of reason to keep digging. Ava did not look at the license. She looked at him. No, she said again. What it gives you is one more chance to stop embarrassing yourself. Cole laughed louder this time, but the sound fell flat. No one joined him. He glanced around, noticed the silence, and his smile faded by a fraction. Trent signaled toward the rear of the car. Step away from the vehicle. Ava held his gaze for one long second, then did exactly that, measured and unhurried, as if she were humoring a man too small to understand the scale of his mistake. Trent took that obedience as victory. Men like him always did. He moved to the trunk and demanded access. Ava told him he did not have consent. He asked whether she was refusing a lawful order. Ava answered that he had yet to issue one. The old woman in the church hat closed her eyes briefly, like she had heard that rhythm before. Question, trap, distortion, repeat. Cole reached again for his radio. Static. He pressed harder. More static, followed by a burst of broken syllables that made no sense. Trent tried dispatch from his shoulder mic, but the response came back clipped and scrambled, like a voice speaking through water. That was when the first real tremor passed through the lot. It rattled the thin metal sign above the gas station door and sent a shiver across the puddle in a shallow pothole near the pump. Several people turned instinctively toward the western sky. Trent did not. He was too committed now, too hungry to win the moment in front of the crowd. Whatever game you think you are playing, he said, stepping closer to Ava. It ends here. Ava looked past him, not with arrogance, not with panic, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting for a clock to strike. The air carried it clearly now, that low rhythmic chopping sound spreading across the tree line and rolling over the fields in heavy pulses. The teenage boys by the pickup lowered their phones and stared upward. The mechanic took one step back from the curb. The mother pulled her son fully behind her. Even Cole's face changed, his eyes narrowing as he tried and failed to place what he was hearing. Dust began to stir along the far side of the road. The leaves in the pines trembled. Trent finally glanced up, annoyed first, then uncertain. Ava drew one slow breath and said, almost gently, I told you. Your quiet minute is over. The sound did not arrive all at once. It built in layers, first a distant tremor, then a hard mechanical rhythm that pressed down over Briar's edge like a second atmosphere. The teenagers by the pickup truck looked up first, their phones forgotten at their sides. The mechanic at the pump shaded his eyes with one grease-stained hand. The old woman in the church hat gripped her purse tighter, her gaze lifting toward the western tree line where the afternoon haze had begun to churn. Dust rose in thin spirals along the shoulder of the road, and the leaves at the top of the pines started to shiver even though no storm had been forecast. Trent Walker stood frozen for half a heartbeat, his confidence caught between irritation and disbelief, as if his mind refused to accept that something larger than his authority had entered the scene. Cole Mercer took 2 steps back from Ava's car and stared upward, his mouth slightly open, no longer smiling, no longer performing for the crowd. Ava alone remained exactly as she had been, calm, still, her eyes fixed on the sky with the quiet focus of someone who had heard that sound before in places far less forgiving than a rural Georgia gas station. The first dark shape broke over the tree line in a sweeping arc of motion, low enough to flatten the grass beyond the road and send grit skittering across the pavement. It came in with the unmistakable weight of command, not circling, not searching, but arriving. The rotor wash hit the lot like a wall of hot wind, lifting paper cups, receipts, and red dirt into the air. The soda machine rattled against the brick wall. The loose hem of the American flag above Miller's Fuel and Market snapped, so hard it sounded like cloth being torn. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone else whispered a prayer under their breath. Trent reached instinctively for his radio again, but the speaker only spat back broken static and fragments of voices he could not make out. The machine above them was not interested in his confusion. It angled toward the open patch of ground beside the courthouse lot, descending with controlled precision until the entire town seemed to vibrate around it. The 2 cruisers rocked slightly on their suspensions. Dust rolled in thick red clouds across Main Street. Windows trembled. The diner door swung open and 2 more people stepped out, aprons still tied, drawn by the noise and then rooted by what they saw. Briar's Edge had spent years believing itself isolated, protected by distance, custom, and the old lie that nobody important ever came through unless invited. But now the sky itself had cut that lie in half. Trent turned toward Ava with the first real crack in his face, and what he saw there unsettled him more than the aircraft, more than the dust, more than the crowd. She was not relieved. She was not triumphant. She was simply finished waiting. What did you do? He asked, and for the first time since he had stepped out of his cruiser, his voice sounded smaller than the badge on his chest. Ava did not answer immediately. She watched as the aircraft settled lower, as the wind flattened the weeds along the curb, as every person in that parking lot instinctively stepped back from her, as if some invisible line had just been drawn around where she stood. Then she looked at Trent with a calm so complete it almost felt merciful. I did not do anything, she said. I told you the truth. You were too busy enjoying your power to hear it. Cole swallowed hard and glanced toward the sheriff's office across the street, but no one was coming to save him from what the next few seconds would mean. The aircraft touched down beyond the courthouse lot in a storm of red dust and spinning heat, and the side door slid open. Figures in dark tactical uniforms emerged one by one, moving with disciplined speed, not frantic, not loud, just precise in a way that made local authority suddenly look like a child's costume. Their boots struck the ground with purpose. Their eyes swept the scene once and understood everything they needed to know. The crowd fell silent. The engines kept pounding overhead. Trent Walker stood there in the middle of his own town and felt, perhaps for the first time in his career, what it meant to be the one under scrutiny. The rotor wash still rolled across the courthouse lot in hot, violent waves of dust and noise, but the moment the tall man stepped down from the aircraft, the chaos seemed to reorganize itself around him. He moved with the kind of authority that never needed to be announced twice, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair silvering at the temples, dark tactical uniform clean despite the storm he had just walked through. The patch on his chest caught the light for only a second before dust swept over it again, but it was long enough for the nearest people to understand this was not county, not state. and not anything Briar's Edge had the power to delay. Two members of his team fanned out toward the perimeter, scanning rooftops, street corners, parked vehicles, and the courthouse steps with cool practiced precision. Another moved straight toward Ava, stopped short of touching her, and said something brief into an earpiece before nodding once. The tall man did not look at Trent Walker first. He looked at Ava. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm and direct, cutting through the thunder of the blades overhead with no effort at all. "Are you injured?" Ava shook her head. "No, Colonel." That single word landed harder than the aircraft had. "Colonel." Trent heard it and felt something inside him drop. Cole Mercer looked from Ava to the man in uniform and back again, as if the scene refused to fit inside the story he had been telling himself for the last 20 minutes. The crowd, which had watched local deputies with weary resignation only minutes earlier, now stood in complete silence, every face turned toward the parking lot, like witnesses to a truth too large to interrupt. The colonel stepped closer, his eyes taking in the cruiser lights, the Virginia license still in Trent's hand, the rental car, the crowd, Ava's restrained posture, and the two deputies standing in the middle of a situation they clearly no longer controlled. When he finally turned to Trent, the look he gave him was not angry. It was worse. It was professional disappointment sharpened by certainty. "Colonel Marcus Reed," he said, "Department of Defense Liaison Command. Which one of you initiated contact with Officer Ava Brooks?" Trent blinked, and the word officer did not register at first because his mind was still trapped on woman, outsider, stranger, suspect. "I did," he managed, trying to recover something of his earlier confidence. She refused to answer basic questions, and Reed lifted one hand, and Trent stopped speaking immediately. "You detained a cleared federal liaison during an active classified movement window," Reed said. "You interfered with a protected operation, disrupted scheduled communications, and compromised a monitored transit route. So let us begin again with much smaller words." "What?" No one in the lot breathed. Ava stood still, dust in the folds of her blouse, sunlight catching at the edge of her watch. And for the first time the people of Briar's Edge saw her the way the world outside their town already did. Not as someone explaining herself to power, but as someone power had been sent to recover. Cole took one uncertain step back. Trent opened his mouth, shut it, then tried again. She would not identify herself properly. Ava's eyes did not leave him. "I identified myself exactly once," she said. "That should have been enough." Reed turned to her. "Your credentials?" Ava gave a small nod toward the passenger side of the rental. One of the tactical officers retrieved the sealed envelope Trent had spent the last several minutes treating like evidence for his own private story. He handed it to Reed, who broke the seal, glanced at the contents, then held up a dark credential wallet just long enough for Trent and Cole to see the insignia they could not possibly mistake now. Federal clearance. Defense intelligence access. Embedded authority higher than either deputy had likely ever encountered in person. Reed closed the wallet and looked at Trent again. Officer Ava Brooks was moving under restricted authorization tied to an ongoing federal investigation, he said. Your town was not the destination. It was the filter. And congratulations, Deputy Walker. You just told us exactly where the problem is. Across the street, the sheriff's office door opened at last, and Sheriff Daniel Hargrove stepped into the dust with a face that went pale before he had even reached the curb. For a long second, Sheriff Daniel Hargrove did not move. He stood at the edge of the courthouse curb with the dust lifting around his polished boots, one hand still near the door he had come through, his face drained of all the steady authority he usually wore like a second uniform. Men like Hargrove survived by reading a room faster than everyone else, and this room had changed in an instant. The deputies were no longer the center of power. The town was no longer protected by distance. And the woman they had treated like a problem had just become the single most important person on the street. Colonel Marcus Reed watched Hargrove approach with the stillness of a man who had already made up his mind. Around them, the tactical team had widened its perimeter with quiet precision. One officer moved toward the sheriff's department entrance. Another crossed to the cruisers and began documenting everything in plain view. Lights, dash positions, radio activity, body camera mounts. Every careless detail small-town arrogance never expected outsiders to examine. Trent Walker noticed that and finally understood the shape of the disaster. This was not a warning. It was an unraveling. Sheriff Hargrove stopped a few feet from Reed and tried to gather his voice into something official. "Colonel," he said, forcing control into the word. "If there has been some misunderstanding, I am sure we can clear it up quickly." Reed did not blink. "What you can do quickly," he said, "is preserve every internal file, dispatch log, traffic stop record, complaint archive, disciplinary note, and camera feed connected to this department for the past 5 years." Hargrove's mouth tightened. The crowd heard it, even if they did not understand all of it. 5 years. That was not about one stop. That was about pattern. That was about history. Ava stood where she had been, no longer surrounded by suspicion, but by a silence edged with respect. The old woman in the church hat looked at her differently now, not like a victim, not even like a survivor, but like someone who had walked into the town carrying a reckoning it had delayed for too long. Cole Mercer shifted his weight and looked toward Hargrove for help, but the sheriff did not look back. Help had become exposure. Reed took one step closer to Hargrove and lowered his voice just enough to make the words colder. "Officer Brooks was running a monitored passage through a corridor flagged for interference by local actors," he said. "Your deputies made contact within minutes, escalated without cause, attempted unauthorized access to protected materials, and confirmed operational concerns already under review." Hargrove stared at Ava then, and the truth finally reached his face. This had not begun today. Today had only revealed it. Trent tried once more to reclaim the narrative. "She was uncooperative," he said, but the sentence sounded weak even before it ended. Reed turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. "No," he said. "She was disciplined. There is a difference you should have learned before they gave you a badge." The words struck harder because they were simple. Across the lot, the teenage boys by the pickup were filming again, but now their hands were steady. The mechanic stood with his arms folded, expression set like a man watching a wall crack exactly where he always knew it was weakest. Inside Miller's Fuel and Market, the cashier had come out from behind the register and stood in the doorway, one hand over her chest, blinking through the dust as if she were seeing justice arrive in a form she had stopped expecting. Reed nodded once to a member of his team. 2 agents approached Trent and Cole, not rough, not theatrical, just firm in the way true authority never needs a performance. Their badges were requested. Their service weapons were removed from duty control. Their radios were taken offline. Every motion was clean, procedural, undeniable. Trent's face burned red beneath the dust. Cole looked like a man trying not to understand what everyone else already could. Then Reed turned to Sheriff Hargrove one final time. "You will step aside from all active supervision pending federal review," he said. "And you will not contact anyone inside this department without oversight." Hargrove's shoulders lowered by half an inch, which was all it took for the town to see it. The performance was over. The badge had not vanished, but the myth behind it had. Ava looked from Trent to Cole to Hargrove, and none of them could meet her eyes for long. Because the deepest humiliation was not public. It was moral. They had spent their power trying to make her feel small, and in the end, all they had done was reveal how small their power really was. The dust did not settle right away. It hung over Briar's Edge in a red haze, softening the courthouse columns, blurring the gas station sign, turning every familiar outline in town into something newly exposed. The rotor blades above kept cutting the air in steady thunder, but the real silence had already fallen somewhere deeper, inside the people standing there, inside the deputies whose hands no longer rested near power, inside the sheriff who now looked older than he had 10 minutes before. Ava Brooks stood in the center of it all with the same calm she had carried from the moment Trent Walker first stepped out of his cruiser. That was what stayed with the town later. Not anger, not fear. The calm. The kind of calm that does not come from being rescued, but from knowing the truth never needed permission to arrive. Colonel Marcus Reed gave a short signal to his team, and the movement around the lot shifted from confrontation to conclusion. One agent collected the final statements from the nearest personnel. Another secured the sealed materials from Ava's vehicle with careful chain of custody precision. Near the cruisers, Trent and Cole stood apart now, no longer shoulder to shoulder in the easy confidence that had first defined them. Without the performance, without the audience under their control, they looked what they truly were. 2 men who had mistaken a local habit for permanent authority. Sheriff Hargrove remained near the curb, hands empty, watching his department pass into someone else's review. The crowd had not dispersed. People who had learned all their lives to lower their eyes were still standing there, still watching, as if leaving too soon might wake them from something they had waited years to see. The old woman in the church hat took a step closer to the edge of the lot. The mechanic removed his cap. The cashier from Miller's Fuel and Market stood in the doorway with tears caught in the corners of her eyes, but no shame in them. For once, no one seemed eager to explain away what had happened. Ava turned at last toward Trent Walker. He could not hold her gaze for more than a second before looking down, then up again, embarrassed by his own uncertainty. There were 1,000 things he could have said in that moment. Excuses about policy, suspicion, procedure, town safety, attitude, instinct. Men like him always found language when they needed to protect themselves. But the dust, the helicopter, the federal insignia, the witnesses, the silence of the crowd, all of it had stripped his words of their hiding place. Ava stepped toward him once, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to soften the truth. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it. "You thought the badge made you the measure of who belongs," she said. "It did not. It only revealed what you become when no one stops you." Trent stared at her, jaw tight, face pale beneath the red dust, and for the first time there was no answer waiting for him. Ava let the silence finish the lesson. Then she turned to Sheriff Hargrove, who looked as if he wanted to speak, but had finally understood that speaking was how men like him had hidden from listening for far too long. "This town did not become this way in one afternoon," she said. "It became this way every time fear was called order and bias was called judgment." No one argued with her. Not the sheriff. Not the deputies. Not the crowd. Because some truths do not need force once they have been seen in daylight. Colonel Reed approached and offered a respectful nod. "Vehicle is ready, Officer Brooks." She returned the nod and walked with him toward the waiting transport team, measured and composed, her shoes crossing the same dusty pavement where she had been made into a spectacle less than an hour earlier. But now the road belonged to a different story. As she passed the old woman in the church hat, their eyes met for a brief moment, and something unspoken moved between them: recognition, grief, dignity, maybe even relief. Then Ava stepped beyond the edge of the lot. Behind her, the town remained motionless, held in the strange weight that comes after false power collapses and before real accountability begins. The rotor thunder rose again as the aircraft prepared to lift. Papers skittered across the curb. Dust spiraled into the late afternoon light. And in Briar's Edge, where badges had long been used to make truth feel small, the truth did not shout. It did not beg. It simply arrived, stood in the open, and made everyone look at what they had chosen not to see. Because that is the thing about borrowed power. It feels absolute right up until the moment real authority enters the room. And when it does, all that remains is character.